Welcome to the Glad You Knew Politics Podcast. I'm Rhys and here with me is my co-host Nathan Aim, and today we're speaking with economics expert Catherine de Fontenay, who is a professor at the University of Melbourne's Melbourne Business School, as well as her new role as a commissioner at the Productivity Commission.
We speak to Catherine about the job prospects of young Australians amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, how the pandemic has affected us here in Australia, and job-finding tips that Catherine gives to her own daughter, Rhys. It almost felt like we were Catherine's own children when she was giving us such great advice.
I think she's adopted us, Nathan. We might be over for Christmas the way it's going at the moment. So let's get stuck in with another Glad You Knew Politics podcast with Catherine de Fontenay. Okay, so hello Catherine.
Hello Nathan, hello Rhys.
Nice to be with you.
Fantastic for you to be on the show with us and covering your article from the conversation on how this pandemic will really affect young people differently. I often think about how older generations bash younger generations such as millennials for being lazy or entitled. Is it often easier to jump to these conclusions than get to the root of an issue and understand the factors that many contribute to how young people are facing difficulty in finding so-called good jobs?
That's a really good point, Rhys. I think that over 35s are really unaware of how hard the job market has become for job seekers, even before coronavirus. And as a result, there's a sort of just get a job kind of attitude in my cohort, which the more we dug into this, the more we realized that the job market really had changed since 2008, and it really was substantially harder for young people. And it was pretty invisible to those of us who were already working, because the hard bit is when you're looking for a job and just a lot of increased competition when you're looking for a job. So the young people that we interact with, they already have jobs. And so it's not until they start telling us about their friends who are still stuck in a terrible casual job that we start to realize just how bad it is.
And so when we talk about young people, they seem to be, unless you get a job at maybe an internship that leads to a full-time job, or maybe you're one of the lucky few that gets into those highly competitive graduate programs that are, very sought after. I feel that a lot of young people, and perhaps these days also the older generations, where they're kind of stuck in temporary work that's, part-time or casual. And I think even in my experiences where I've tutored some high school kids and their parents were lecturers at the University of Melbourne, well, temporary lectures, and sometimes that kind of work can be, they feel that it's a bit anxious because they might get work this semester, but, not next semester. And you've spoken about how there's been a big increase in the amount of part-time and casual work. And, possibly explaining this could be that jobs used to be full-time are becoming now part-time or casual, or that there is more jobs that are in other sectors like hospitality and retail, but those jobs are more part-time and casual.
So I think what's been going on is there's been an expansion in part-time and casual work. It hasn't always been a substitution from full-time work. So what we found was that after 2008, so the global financial crisis, and then after that, the end of the mining boom, labor demand in Australia was a bit slower. But labor supply continues to grow with population growth, and particularly for those of us that are doing uni degrees, there was also a big expansion of the uni sector. So the number of uni graduates increased by 1/3 from 2009 to 2013, which is huge when you think about it. And so unsurprisingly, you found a lot more young people competing for a lot smaller set of jobs. And that was really tough. So the way this plays out is you might be a law graduate and you're hoping to work at Freehills or Mallison's, one of the big law firms. You don't get a job there, you start applying for smaller law firms, and you don't get a job there. You might end up working as a paralegal or working in a cafe job while you're trying to find the job of your dreams. So we're seeing people move down the occupation ladder is how we're describing it. And it's a worrying process. We're seeing people start lower on the jobs ladder and having more trouble moving up the rungs. Now, in terms of this increase in part-time and casual work, it's kind of a good news, bad news story. So you had this imbalance between how many people wanted to work and how many jobs there were. Down at the bottom of the ladder, in the less attractive jobs, there's been a big expansion in part-time and casual work. The good news is that means people haven't been pushed off the job ladder entirely. They've been able to find part-time work. So most 20 to 24-year-olds have been pushed out of full-time work and into part-time work, but it does mean that they are still able to find some work. So in other slow job periods, we've seen a lot of unemployment. At least before COVID, we really didn't see a lot of unemployment.
And when you talk about part-time and casual work, I think immediately of my sister who's late 30s, and she worked part-time with the Spirit of Tasmania and had to supplement her part-time work with other hospitality jobs as she couldn't find full-time work. I feel like this big increase in part-time and casual work is something that just feels scary to me. I'm not sure part-time and casual work has always played a big part in our economy, but I just feel worried that a large number of Australians have to rely on low-skilled part-time or casual work. I just can't imagine doing hospitality for the rest of my life. And could you tell us what you found on the pros and cons of an increase in the amount of part-time and casual work a little bit more?
Sure. So for under 25s, this isn't actually a new phenomenon. If you look all the way back to 1990, the decline, there's been a sort of steady decline in the amount of full-time work and an increase in the amount of part-time work. And I think overall, this was a good news story. This was because more people were studying for longer, and so you might not be available for full-time work if you are studying full-time or even part-time. So I think overall that trend is there, and we need to be a little careful at sort of ruling out part-time work entirely. It's also been a really good thing for women who wanted to be at home some of the time but wanted to stay connected to the job market. But what's interesting is that after 2008, we see this big decline in full-time work and an increase in part-time work, and it's mostly among people who are not studying. So that is a big red flag. That tells us that it's not people who want to work part-time. It's people who want to work full-time but are actually getting part-time work. Not 100%, but the fact that they're not studying suggests that they want more hours than they're getting. And over the same period, we see a big increase in what we call underemployment, which is people that respond on surveys that they'd like more hours than they're getting.
Do you think that the Australian government, or when they report statistics about this, they usually only report like the unemployment statistics, and they go unemployment's at 5%, we're in pretty good shape, but they don't report on other, I think, more meaningful statistics where they go unemployment's at 5%, but underemployment, as you said, is at so and so, and that gives maybe a better picture of how things are going. Because when I think about it as well, you often see maybe in the United States where he goes, the stock market's booming, and that must mean everything is going very well, but that's maybe not, I think, a true representation of how regular people are faring in this kind of economy.
Yeah, we can certainly pick and choose the statistics that make our point. I think there has been increasing attention to underemployment, not just unemployment, for exactly that reason, Nathan, and you're right. But I think in a period like COVID, we're going to go back to focusing mostly on the unemployment rate. And that's for a really good reason, which is that what we're most worried about is people, we're going to be interested in the unemployment rate, and we're going to be interested in how many people drop out of the labor force. What we're worried about is people that disengage completely from job markets and training markets and end up really disengaged from society and find it really hard to find a pathway back into work. And, work is a really satisfying thing for most of us, not for all of us. Some of us have really unpleasant jobs, but it's a big way that we're connected to other people. And so becoming fully disengaged like that is a very serious problem.
Do you think people will be even more disengaged from the job market, from what you just said, because of the pandemic? Yeah. Does it frighten you as an economist?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely the thing that keeps me up at night, and I'm a parent, so it's it's really worrying because we know that unemployment has already gone way up, and we are predicting that recovery is going to be slow, and we're going to be in limbo potentially for quite some time. And then even after that, once there's a vaccine that's widely distributed, recovery could still be quite slow as we make some big adjustments. And so there's the potential for people to be unemployed, come out of uni or come out of their vet degree or come out of high school and just be unemployed for 1, 2, 3 years. We know that that has long-term effects on their opportunities in the job market. In economics, we call it scarring. And I think there's some psychological scarring too. You know, it's not a pleasant thing to spend 2 years in your parents' basement, you know, wishing you were doing something else. Uh, and in normal times, we would see people choose to do more study to kind of improve their chances on the job market and just fill in that time when they're looking for work. But one thing that really worries me is as I talk to some uni students among my daughter's friends and friends of friends, a lot of them are finding this online study really not engaging. And so I'm very worried that people are going to disengage from studies and disengage from the workforce and find it really hard to find their way back.
And adding on to your point about scarring and how long it can last for, what I found interesting is that overseas evidence suggests that we can see the effect of a recession on people's careers after 10 years and sometimes 15, but usually not after that. And I think the point about psychological effects of this, you know, not just even now during the pandemic, but before, where I've read something along the lines of, I'm not sure how it's completely linked, but bear with me. It goes where it's a bit on a topic of hope, where you might have two people, for example, where one person might be someone that lives in, let's say in Melbourne, where in the metro area, where they go to university, and for them, their prospects seem pretty bright, like they go to university, and the job prospect of, you know, finding full-time work and meaningful work is, you know, usually pretty high or reasonable. I don't know, but then if you contrast it with someone that maybe lives in a regional town and somewhere in Western Australia or somewhere else and not so an urban area, and maybe perhaps they don't have the same degree, they don't have the same opportunities, but throughout their you know lives, what they have to look forward to is just casual or part-time work, or you know. And do you think that's an impact where people find that their hope for the future is not the same across the board?
Yeah, I think people are very worried. Young people are worried, and young people are gloomy. And I think not having something to hope, to look forward to, and something to aspire to, yeah, it's very difficult psychologically. And so I think when we look at the economic reality and we say it's going to be a long, hard road ahead, it's very worrying what that means for young people.
And I think that means differently for all kinds of people, because some people, when they go, it's going to be a long road ahead. For some, like, you know, it might be, it's just going to be a very boring lockdown. Like for us in Melbourne, when we go, it's going to be a long road. The worst we're thinking of, it's going to be 6 weeks of just very boring, doing nothing, walking around the house, seeing the same 3 faces in our family, or 4, or how many you have. But for some others, it might be.
And me too, Nate.
Yeah.
You know, I'm sick of seeing Rhys.
I think it's one of the worst things about the lockdown, actually, is that it turns our focus inward. Like, this situation is hard for everyone in Melbourne, and we are all struggling. But it makes us concentrate on how difficult life is for us, whereas actually often the impacts are a group that we are not part of, the group that have lost their jobs, or the group that are studying and have worse prospects. So yeah, the kind of innate selfishness of trying to make it through lockdown is a problem.
For me, the biggest kind of stress or my biggest hope for the week is what takeaway are we going to have this weekend or next weekend to get us through the weeks. But for some, it might be, as you said, you know, paying the bills, or finding how to make ends meet.
And I apologize. I didn't mean to suggest that lockdown was not incredibly hard, not only for economic circumstances. So there's
no, absolutely,
people who are finding it really psychologically difficult. But there's some of us that perhaps would be focusing more on the broader economic situation if we were not concentrating on getting through lockdown.
I'm interested, Catherine, was this the reason moments like this, that we're in a recession and we're in a tough financial situation, was this the moments that you live for, or the purpose of being an economist? What inspired you to be an economist? Because numbers to me are like a foreign language. So what captured your imagination?
Well, I'm sorry to say that I'm from Washington, D.C., and so everyone I know is an economist or a lawyer, and it seemed by far the lesser of two evils. But no, I think economics is fascinating. It is a gloomy science because we do kind of come into our own at these really difficult moments. But it's amazing getting to spend your career worrying about people's well-being and what we can do to give them more opportunities in terms of studying, in terms of jobs, people in developing countries, what we can do about how we help them out and how we trade with them to improve outcomes in developing countries. There's a lot that's really exciting about economics.
Well, I'm just glad you're not working on K Street as a lobbyist and
That is the worst of all evils.
But speaking back to the pandemic and how it's affecting Australians, is it really highlighting more so than ever the growing inequality in Australia?
The pandemic in all countries has brought inequality into sharp relief. One of the main roots of that is that some of us have jobs that can be done from home, and often the less well-paid jobs, such as working in a cafe or working at Coles, those are jobs that can't be done from home. And so people are finding themselves having to put themselves in harm's way, put themselves at risk of COVID to do their job. And also many of those jobs are just no longer there because of changes in the economy. So I think it has accentuated inequality, and we are going to have to think about that pretty seriously.
Here in Australia, Catherine, and especially with the rhetoric pushed by our government and the Australians, we almost have our own version of the American dream, and that we believe a fair go and where you'll reap the rewards of all your hard work. What do you make of this ideal?
Well, I think that as Australians, so I am an Australian citizen, but I do take an outsider's perspective sometimes. I think that one can take certain amazing things about Australia for granted and underestimate how much those contribute to equality. So schemes like HEX, while not popular with everybody, do mean that everyone can go to university relative to, say, the United States, where that's really out of reach for many students, or who incur crushing student loans, which are not income contingent. So if you don't earn enough money, you still have to repay your student loan, and it's a very serious problem at a time like this. And many other public goods that we enjoy that are level the playing field. And I think it's important to remember those. That said, inequality has been on the rise in Australia. Income inequality has been on the rise in Australia for a long time. And people don't always realize that. So inequality today is a little bit worse than it was in the United States in 1980, for example. Now, inequality in the US has continued to increase, but it is worth bearing in mind that it's not as though Australia and somewhere like the United States are worlds apart in that sense. What Australia does have, in addition to HEX and Medicare and other supports, the Centrelink program, while not always pleasant to deal with, does actually provide a good amount of support when your income falls below a certain level. So relative to some other countries, at least people who can access Centrelink find that there is some compensation for the initial income inequality.
Well, there's two things that, for one, is on our first episode, we actually spoke to Bruce Chapman, which is the architect of HEX. And so if you would like to know more about that, our listeners can go to our first podcast. And the second thing is, inequality seems to be a kind of a catch-all term that, we hear about in the news, or you hear about being thrown around, and people go, yeah, it's bad, but they don't really perhaps feel why it's so bad. Like, could you maybe explain why it's something we should be worried about, and it's not just something that is just, I'm doing all right, and, it's okay for me, so it's not really a problem, I don't think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, so economists have different views on inequality, I should say, and inequality has good and bad points. Obviously, if everybody earns exactly the same amount in a society, regardless of what they do, then there's not a lot of incentive to be entrepreneurial, to work extra hours, to start businesses. So a certain amount of inequality economists view as necessary to sort of grow the economy. But if inequality gets beyond a certain point, it's going to create a lot of tension, political tension, and often there can be a backlash against things that are beneficial for Australia as a whole, but are not really benefiting the bottom half of Australians. So to take an example of another country, in the United States, some researchers have calculated that the bottom 50% of workers are worse off today in real terms than they were in 1960. All right, so just deal with that for a minute. That means that half the people in America have been getting worse off over time for more than 50 years. Yeah. So once you realize that, it's no longer so surprising that there are such extreme social tensions going on there at the moment. So it's worth thinking about what policies, and I think Australia does think about this, what policies can soften the impacts of inequality and reduce some of the negative effects.
Are you worried that Australia could one day turn into America with no healthcare, no HEX? Is that a fear that Australia could be similar to America in some capacity?
I think any democracy has the potential to go a number of different ways, and that's the scary thing about democracy is none of us individually control where it heads. And essentially good economists are plumbers. They should not be telling you what level of inequality you're choosing or what type of society you want, but they should be telling you the best, the most efficient way to achieve the goals that you have, the economic and social goals that you have. So it's possible that Australia will choose higher and higher levels of inequality. It's possible that Australia will implement policies that will reduce the amount of inequality.
Do you see Australian society as an individualistic perspective? Because I know we see on social media, Nathan and I, that people only care about themselves, and they use tropes such as debt, and people don't really understand what debt is, so that they say that why are our taxes so low, and why are our taxes so high rather, and instead of caring about every individual in society, is that something that more Australians of a younger generation should be made more aware of?
Again, speaking as an outsider, I think all Western societies have a fair amount of individualism in them, and it can reach some extreme levels. I certainly think it's a good thing to be aware of what we get from our taxes and be aware of what the costs are of providing some of the great services we enjoy here. And so so personally, I love paying my taxes because you get so many things for them in Australia, and it's a great pleasure. And so I think that perhaps reframing that narrative around what public goods we are buying with our taxes would be a really helpful thing.
And I think that comes to kind of the thing that I've read about a lot is Reaganomics or trickle down economics, where it seems to make sense on the surface, where you go to create jobs or to stimulate the economy, you kind of want to firstly cut taxes, because taxes are preventing people and taking away money from people, and therefore if you cut taxes and you continue to massively deregulate everything, that's where businesses will thrive, and that's how we get things going. And I think a lot of the big proponents of such ideas is Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher, and even I think our current treasurer George Frydenberg said that he took inspiration from his economic inspiration from these people. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I think most economists would agree that, again, there's this tension, there's a certain amount of tension between inequality and growth, and that to create, for example, at one point, the UK had a 90% tax on its very highest income earners. And that turned out to be very counterproductive, because people just arranged to receive perks that were difficult to identify and tax rather than be taxed at that tax rate. And so it ended up generating a lot less growth and less tax than a more sensible tax rate. So there is going to be a trade-off between how much equality you can achieve and how much incentive there will be to earn money, to be entrepreneurial, to grow the economy. And people do benefit from the jobs that are created by those entrepreneurial people, and from the money that those entrepreneurial people spend after they earn it, and so on and so forth. So that tension is always going to be there. The important thing is that we're all part of the conversation to decide, where do we want to be on that trade-off? Do we want to be a society with more equality and less growth, which is fine if we choose that as a society? Do we want to be a society with a little bit more inequality and less growth? But just as taxation can reach a counterproductive point, we've already discussed that inequality can reach a counterproductive point where it creates acute social tension. And so then you get inequality and no growth if tension reaches too extreme a point.
You see so much on so many political commentators, or should I say the Studio 10 people on there, and they always say the economy's falling by the wayside, and how do you deal with people who use these tropes, and especially again with debt? People talk about that Australians' economy is by the wayside. Can you explain debt to us, that it's very different to how we have debt to how a country has debt? Sorry, that's two questions in one there.
I think you're right that it's worth acknowledging that Australia's had a really long stretch of uninterrupted growth, and we should be happy and grateful to be in the lucky country. So it's important, we can see social and economic problems without being too alarmist about them. That said, COVID is probably as big a crisis as we've experienced since the Great Depression. So we don't want to underestimate the size of the current shock. Where it's still early days, but it could be an extremely major shock. In terms of debt, economists think that in times of recession, governments should be spending to soften the blow of that recession or depression. And so the worse the depression, the more they should be spending. So in a very serious shock like the current one, they should be spending like a drunken sailor, and that is what we have seen. And so that's good. Now, how do they fund that? They fund that with debt. And we worry about that debt because at an individual level, we know that debt is bad, and debt often means that your financial position is unsustainable. So if you have a friend who is paying off his credit card with his other credit card, you know that you have to have a talk with them. It's an issue. Countries' debt is a little different to that because countries are growing, as you mentioned. And so their ability to repay that debt from investment will be higher in the future. So if they're borrowing today to make investments that are going to be productive in the future, that's a good thing. And that debt can be repaid. And if they're borrowing to soften the blow of a recession, we can pay for that by tightening our belt in a really good time in the future. And that is entirely appropriate again. So for those two reasons, debt is often a good idea for a country. People worry about Australia's debt, but it's really important to remember that we have incredibly low national debt relative to other wealthy countries. So our debt at the moment, is just orders of magnitude below Japan, below the United States, below a number of other countries. So it isn't something that should be causing us stress in this particular period.
Maybe we should introduce the Australian government to Afterpay or some of these credit services that can help us explain or help them better approach this issue. But as a whole, and you talk about how in a recession like this we have to, or economists say that we should soften the blow by spending more money, and that's through debt. And in the last recession that Australia had, I think in the 1990s, Paul Keating said that this is the recession that Australia had to have, to implement his reforms and to help Australia get us back on track. I don't think this is the same for this recession. And how has Australia has been handling and approaching this recession and pandemic?
In broad terms, the idea of worrying about the welfare impact on people of losing their jobs. So those are the job seeker policies. A lot more people are unemployed, and their chance of finding a job for quite some time is going to be low. So a generous job seeker policy is a good idea. In terms of businesses, this is a very unusual recession. So some businesses were closed by regulation. You had a cafe, and then once stage 4 starts, you are no longer available for sit-down meals or anything except takeaway. And so a lot of businesses and certain businesses have had to close. So hairdressers are now closed in Melbourne. So that's quite different because you say to yourself, well, you have businesses that are probably viable once lockdown finishes, but that are in dire financial straits right now. So the types of policies that are being designed have in mind that this is really a weird situation where some businesses that are in extreme financial pressure may be perfectly viable businesses in 3 months' time. And so it's involved really different policies. So are they perfect? No, but they needed to be rolled out incredibly fast, and they were, and that's very impressive.
Because we are part of that young generation, what is going to be the pandemic's impact in relative terms on us and for your daughter and for all young people?
Look, I think that for uni grads, what it's going to mean is that the number of graduate positions outweighs the number of people who are seeking for a few years probably. And so that's going to make things very stressful, and it's going to make things very competitive when people are looking for jobs. What options do people have in that type of market? Some people are going to decide to go back to school and get additional, maybe do a postgraduate degree. And it's not a bad option because you get additional skills, and also you don't have to go back to the job market until perhaps things have improved. So it's a reasonable strategy, and one that we see young people following in recessions is to get more study. The other option is the one that we described in our report, which is to sort of move down that occupational ladder and perhaps accept a job that was not the one that you were hoping for while you're looking for a job. And any job gives you an opportunity to demonstrate conscientiousness and hard work, and enthusiasm for the work. So it can still be a useful thing on your CV for when you're finally looking for work. The last opportunity that people don't think about very much, depending on what your financial situation is volunteering. So sometimes volunteering, you can choose a really interesting organization. You might be able to do something that is a skill that's really valuable for your CV. So thinking carefully about what volunteer opportunities are out there is also worth doing.
Because you are our favourite mum on the podcast series here, Catherine,
Wow.
what advice did you give? Fantastic what you've just said there, but what advice would you say to your daughter on how you can stand out from the crowd? Is that by learning the another skill, as you said, or what is another way that can stand out from all the crowd? Now it's become a careers meeting, but but now it's not every day you get one of the best economists in Australia on your pod.
Well, so the first thing I should say is that when I started this research project, her main reaction was, "I told you so. I told you it was hard to find a job." She's decided to continue her studies. So again, option one. But also she does some volunteering. I think that internships, if you can get them, are a great opportunity. But obviously, lots of us are competing again for a small number of internships. Internships, even at less exciting places, are still a good option. So it is worth casting a broad net.
I've got another one. If Nathan, you don't want to jump in.
No, you go ahead.
From your findings from your article, I would love to finish on this point. Because our podcast is called Glad You Knew, from your findings, what would you be glad people knew about what you found on the economic situation?
Well, I think that I would be really happy if over 35s knew that it has been tough for young people for some time. And when we make decisions about the tax and transfer system in the next decade and income support and things like that, it's going to be important for us to think about young people and place a priority on supporting them. The pandemic cast all of that in really sharp relief, because it's essentially your generation sacrificing its aspirations for the next few years to keep older people safe. So it kind of, it pits the generations against each other in a really extreme way. And so people over 35 need to think about how they can support younger generations in the years to come.
Well, I'll just be glad that there won't be any big articles on Facebook or the news or anywhere else where they just keep saying that millennials are the most lazy generation that the world has ever witnessed. And what I found, it's not an economic thing, but what I found really interesting about this is that I read on the BBC they went into this and delved into the history of such phrases, and they found that throughout every generation in the past, they've all claimed that the generation that came after them, or no, that came before or after them?
Before.
the younger generation that's younger than them, they've always claimed that generation's always lazy, disrespectful, and one of the very interesting things that I thought of, especially, is that when you look at maybe the early 20th century, you have most people working on farms, and they work on agriculture and farms, and when their children or the next generation goes and works in an office space, they go, wow, that generation's very lazy. They just sit in an office all day. They don't do much. They need some hard work in them.
And that music they listen to is just a racket. Yeah. Some things never change.
Yeah.
I think you wouldn't be opposed to being on your daughter's TikTok.
I definitely would be opposed to that.
Just say it's a privacy concern.
Okay.
Oh, Catherine, and I know as well this is going to be a difficult question looking ahead to the future when you are like us, 21. How do you think we'll look back in 30 years' time from this pandemic and this situation? I know it's hard to speculate, but what do you think we'll learn from this?
I don't know if you remember a phrase from your VCE days, the phrase of pathways, that there are many pathways to get to the type of study that you're hoping to do. You might not get in straight away, but you could do a vet course and then go on to your desired subject, or there's a number of different pathways you can follow. And I think in 20 years, your generation will look back and realize that you actually eventually found jobs that you were really excited about, lots of opportunities that have been great. But the pathway there was a little more roundabout than it would have been without COVID. We can see that after 10, 15 years, the effects of graduating in a bad recession, they tend to dissipate. Generally, people have found a pathway through changing jobs, through trying new things. They've found a pathway to a pretty good wage and a pretty good job opportunity. But it does take a while. And so, patience is not, it's pretty classic. Again, our generation preaching patience, but some patience is going to be required, and saying yes to a lot of opportunities.
Oh, you're talking about economic scarring. I'm just having VCE scarring. You're just talking about the pathways again.
That is a very scarring experience.
But I think there'll be, once people discover the pathways, I think there'll be maybe a lot of opportunities that you might not expect, because everyone's trying to figure it out as well in this time. And the new pathways would be new opportunities for people that might maybe not get them usually.
Yeah, that's right. So let's try and be hopeful about these
Absolutely. And I think on that optimistic note, I think it's a terrific way to end this podcast. So thank you very much for speaking with us and taking the time out of your day to talk with us.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks so much, Catherine.
Thank you for listening to the Glad You Knew Politics podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast. Leave us a rating and a review on what you thought about this week's episode, and any other questions you might have or issues you would like us to cover in future episodes. You can keep up to date with us and the podcast by following us at Glad You Knew on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Links are in the description below.